Welcome to our deep dive on Tawḥīd in Islam. I find it fascinating how this one concept, the oneness of God, has sparked so many different interpretations, like throughout Islamic history. It's amazing. Today, we're going to explore this evolution of thought and then delve much deeper into one particularly intriguing perspective, the Ismaili interpretation.
It's true. The idea of God's unity has been a central theme in Islamic thought for centuries, and each school of thought has wrestled with it in its own way, adding to the richness and complexity of the conversation.
So it's like we're taking a journey through time. We're tracing how this idea of Tawḥīd has developed and branched out, kind of like a family tree of interpretations. Where should we start on this historical timeline?
Oh, a great place to begin is with the Sunni Kalām theologians. These folks were all about using reason and logic to understand God, and their discussions laid the groundwork for many later interpretations.
Okay, Kalām theologians. I've heard that term before, but I always get a bit fuzzy on the details. Could you give us a quick refresher?
Of course. Kalām essentially means speech, or logos in Arabic. It refers to a school of Islamic thought that uses reason and argumentation to explore theological questions. You could think of it as the Islamic equivalent of philosophy of religion.
Right, so they were the ones trying to figure out the nature of God through reason, debate, and analysis. And within this Kalām tradition, were there different schools of thought on Tawḥīd?
Absolutely. Three major schools emerged within Sunni Kalām: the Muʿtazilīs, the Ashʿarīs, and the Māturīdīs. And each of these schools had a slightly different take on how to reconcile God's oneness with the concept of his attributes.
Okay, so let's break them down one by one. Who were these Mu'tazilites and what made their perspective on Tawḥīd unique?
The Mu'tazilites were known for their strong emphasis on reason and their belief in free will. When it came to Tawḥīd, they were big proponents of what's called divine simplicity. They argued that God's essence and attributes are one and the same.
Wait, so they're saying that God doesn't have knowledge, for instance, but God is knowledge.
You got it. They believed that any separation between God and his attributes would imply some kind of limitation on God's unity.
I see. So for them, God's essence is so pure, so utterly simple that there can't be any distinction between him and his qualities. It's all just God.
Precisely. A great analogy they used was a perfectly cut diamond. It's one substance, but it reflects many facets of light. In the same way, God is one, but his attributes are like those facets, simply different expressions of his singular essence.
That's a really helpful image. I'm starting to grasp how the Mu'tazilites were thinking about this. But you said there were other Kalām schools with different perspectives. What about the Ashʿarītes? How did they approach the idea of God's attributes?
The Ashʿarītes, who actually became the most popular school among Sunni Muslims, took a slightly different path. They still affirmed God's absolute oneness, but argued that he possesses distinct eternal attributes like knowledge, power, and will.
So unlike the Mu'tazilites, who saw the attributes as identical to God's essence, the Ashʿarītes believed these attributes were separate, but still eternal and uncreated.
Exactly. They emphasize that these attributes are not something God acquired or developed. They've always been a part of his eternal being.
Okay, so now we have two different tastes on Tawḥīd within the Kalām tradition. One emphasizing divine simplicity, and the other affirming distinct eternal attributes. What about that third school you mentioned, the Māturīdīs? Where did they fit in?
The Māturīdīs, while similar to the Ashʿarītes in affirming God's eternal attributes, added another layer to the discussion. They emphasize that not only are God's attributes eternal, but so are his actions, like creation.
So are they saying that God has always been creating, that creation is an eternal process?
In a way, yes. They argued that God's act of creation is not something that started at a specific point in time. It's an eternal aspect of his being, just like his attributes.
Wow. So within the Kalām schools alone, we already see three distinct interpretations of Tawḥīd, each with its own subtle nuances and arguments. It's fascinating to see how these thinkers were grappling with such profound questions about the nature of God and creation.
Absolutely. And these early debates within Kalām laid the foundation for many other interpretations that would develop later in Islamic history.
So where do we go next on our historical timeline of Tawḥīd? Who else contributed to this evolving conversation?
Well, before we jump to the philosophers and mystics, there's another group within Sunni Islam that's important to consider, the Ḥanbalīs school. They're known for their strict adherence to the Quran and Hadith and their aversion to philosophical speculation.
Ah, the Ḥanbalīs. They were the ones who emphasized taking the scriptures literally right. No fancy interpretations or philosophical gymnastics.
You could say that. They were very cautious about trying to explain or interpret God's attributes in a way that might compromise his absolute transcendence. They had a famous saying, bila kaif, which means without modality or without asking how.
So if they came across a verse in the Quran that described God's hand, for instance, they wouldn't try to figure out how God has a hand.
Exactly. They would simply affirm the statement as it's revealed in the scripture, trusting that God knows best and that it's not our place to question or analyze his nature.
It's a very devout and humble approach, isn't it? Acknowledging the limits of human understanding and simply accepting what's been revealed.
It is, and this approach reflects their deep commitment to preserving the mystery and majesty of God. One of their key scholars, Ibn Qudama, even advocated for what he called consigning the meaning to God, basically saying, we trust the words of Scripture and we leave it to God to know their ultimate meaning.
I can see how that would be a comforting stance for many believers. It frees you from the burden of trying to intellectually grasp the incomprehensible.
You got it. It's about surrendering to the mystery and acknowledging that our finite minds can't fully comprehend the infinite.
So we've explored the Kalām theologians and the Ḥanbalī approach, all within the realm of Sunni Islam. What about other branches of Islam? Did they contribute to this discussion on Tawḥīd as well?
They absolutely did, and perhaps one of the most unique and intriguing perspectives comes from the Ismaili school of thought, a branch of Shia Islam. They take a very distinctive approach to understanding God's unity.
Okay, the Ismailis. Now we're getting to the part I'm really excited about. You mentioned earlier that they have a particularly fascinating take on Tawḥīd. What makes their perspective so unique?
Well, the Ismailis are known for their strong emphasis on apophatic theology. Essentially, this means approaching God by negating any qualities or descriptions that could limit his absolute transcendence.
So instead of saying what God is, they focus on what God is not.
Precisely. And they take this negation even further than most other schools. While many would agree that God doesn't have physical attributes, the Ismailis go beyond that, negating even spiritual attributes like knowledge, power, or will, which many others would readily ascribe to God.
Wait, so they're saying God doesn't even know things? That seems radical. How can you have a God who doesn't know anything?
It's not that they believe God is ignorant. It's more about recognizing that human concepts like knowledge or power are simply inadequate to describe the divine. To say God knows things implies a process of acquiring information which would contradict God's absolute perfection and self-sufficiency.
Okay, I'm starting to get a sense of their logic here. It's like they're trying to protect God from being limited by our human categories of understanding.
Exactly. And they argue that when we see those names of God, like the knowing or the powerful in the scriptures, we shouldn't understand them literally. They're more like metaphors, what they call metonyms.
Metonyms, you mean like when we say the White House announced, but we actually mean the president and his administration made the announcement.
That's a perfect example. In the same way the Ismailis would say those names of God are pointing to God bestowing those qualities on creation rather than possessing them himself in any limited human-like way.
Ah, I see. So it's not that God has knowledge or power in some static way. It's that he actively bestows these qualities on creation.
You've got it. And this is where their concept of the first intellect comes in.
Okay, the first intellect. This was something you hinted at earlier. I'm really curious to hear more about this.
The first intellect is a key concept in Ismaili thought. They believe it's the first and most perfect creation of God emanating directly from his being. And here's the interesting part. They say this first intellect actually possesses all those qualities that other schools might attribute to God directly.
So it's like the first intellect acts as this intermediary between God's absolute transcendence and the created world. It becomes the locus of those divine qualities that we can't properly ascribe to God himself because of his utter otherness.
Exactly. It's a fascinating way to reconcile the absolute unity and transcendence of God with the manifestation of his attributes in the world.
Wow, this is already blowing my mind. But you mentioned something earlier about the Ismaili imam being connected to this first intellect. Could you explain that a bit more? I'm eager to see how that all fits in.
That's a great point to pick up on, and it's where we'll delve deeper into the Ismaili perspective next.
All right, we're back. And I'm ready to unpack this connection between the first intellect and the imam. I have to admit, I'm finding the Ismaili interpretation of Tawḥīd really thought-provoking.
It's definitely a perspective that pushes us to expand our understanding of God's oneness.
So remind me again, how do the Ismailis see the first intellect fitting into this whole picture?
They believe the first intellect is this perfect, radiant being, the very first emanation from God. It's the embodiment of all those divine qualities that we might normally attribute directly to God, knowledge, power, will, and so on. But because the Ismailis are so committed to apophatic theology, they say these qualities actually belong to the first intellect, not to God himself.
Right, because to say that God possesses these qualities in any limited way would be to constrain his absolute transcendence. So the first intellect acts as this kind of intermediary, reflecting God's attributes without limiting God himself.
Exactly. And here's where the role of the imam comes into play. The Ismailis believe their imam, their spiritual leader, is a living reflection of the first intellect.
Whoa, hold on. So they're saying the imam is like a mirror, reflecting those divine qualities that emanate from the first intellect.
That's a great way to put it. And through the imam, believers can gain access to those qualities and deepen their understanding of Tawḥīd.
So it's like a chain of emanation. God, then the first intellect, then the imam, and then the believers.
You've got it. The imam becomes this crucial link in helping people connect with the divine. He guides them toward a deeper appreciation of God's unity by embodying those qualities that reflect God's perfection.
This is fascinating stuff. But I have to admit, I'm still grappling with how the Ismailis can, on the one hand, negate any attributes to God, and on the other hand, embrace concepts like the first intellect and the imam. It seems like a bit of a contradiction.
It's a good question, and it gets to the heart of how the Ismailis navigate the paradox of talking about God. They recognize that human language and concepts are ultimately inadequate to describe the divine.
So they're basically saying, we can't put God in a box. Any attempt to define him will fall short.
Precisely. But they also recognize that God's presence is experienced in the world, that his power and wisdom are manifested in creation. So they use concepts like the first intellect and the imam to help us understand how the divine interacts with and is reflected in creation without compromising God's absolute transcendence.
So it's all about acknowledging different levels of reality. On the level of God's ultimate essence, there's nothing we can say or conceive. Any attribute, any description would be limiting. That's where apophatic theology comes in, right?
Exactly. But on the level of creation, we can see those divine qualities manifested in a way that our minds can grasp. And that's where the first intellect and the imam play a vital role, helping us make sense of how God's presence is felt in the world.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how these pieces fit together. It's like a puzzle, where each piece, even the ones that seem contradictory, ultimately contributes to the bigger picture.
It is, and this Ismaili interpretation adds a really unique layer to our understanding of Tawḥīd.
It definitely does. I'm realizing that exploring Tawḥīd is not just about memorizing definitions or theological arguments. It's about expanding our minds to grasp the sheer vastness and mystery of God's unity.
Absolutely. And this exploration takes us on a journey through different schools of thought, each offering its own unique perspective on this central Islamic principle.
Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about the Kalām theologians and the Ismailis, but I know there are other important figures who've contributed to the understanding of Tawḥīd. Someone like Ibn Sīnā, for instance, a famous philosopher.
Ibn Sīnā is definitely a key figure in this conversation. He approached Tawḥīd from a philosophical perspective, and his ideas had a huge impact on later Islamic thought.
I remember reading about his concept of God as the necessary existence. It seemed really profound, but I admit I didn't quite grasp all the implications. Could you walk me through it?
Of course. Ibn Sīnā's philosophy is rooted in the idea that God is the only being whose existence is not contingent on anything else. In other words, everything else in the universe needs something else to exist. But God doesn't need anything. His existence is self-sufficient, independent, necessary.
So everything else relies on something outside of itself to exist, but God is the ultimate source of existence itself.
That's right. And this concept of God as the necessary existence leads him to an understanding of Tawḥīd that's very similar to the Mu'tazilīts' idea of divine simplicity.
Oh, interesting. So Ibn Sīnā, despite being a philosopher, ends up aligning with a particular school of Kalām theology.
He does. He uses this concept of necessary existence to argue that God can't have separate attributes. Because if God had separate attributes, those attributes would either be part of God or separate from him.
And either way, that would contradict the idea of God as the necessary existence, right? Because it would imply some kind of dependency.
Exactly. If the attributes were part of God, they would be necessary for his existence, which would mean God is not self-sufficient. And if they were separate from him, they would be dependent on God for their existence, meaning they're not truly divine.
So for Ibn Sīnā, God's attributes are not separate things added on to God, but rather expressions of his singular necessary existence.
You've got it. And this is where his philosophical approach connects back to the Mu'tazilites and their concept of divine simplicity.
It's amazing how all these different threads from theology to philosophy are weaving together to create this rich tapestry of understanding about God's unity.
It is. And just when you think you've explored all the facets of this tapestry, you encounter someone like Ibn Arabi and his mystical take on Tawḥīd, which adds a whole new dimension to the conversation.
Ibn Arabi, yes. I've heard his name mentioned in connection with the idea of what al-wujud, the unity of being. It sounds incredibly profound, but also a bit mysterious.
It is. And to be fair to Ibn Arabi, he didn't actually use that term himself. What al-wujud is a later interpretation of his ideas, but it captures the essence of what he was getting at.
So can we unpack that essence a bit? What was Ibn Arabi's core insight about the unity of being?
His starting point is the idea that God is absolute existence, the source of all being the ultimate reality from which everything else flows.
Okay, so far so good. So where do we fit into this picture? Where does creation come into play?
Ibn Arabi's view is that all created things are like loci of God's manifestation. Imagine mirrors reflecting a single light source. They exist because God exists, and they reflect his being in a limited way.
So he's saying that there's nothing in existence except God, that everything is somehow a part of God.
That's the core idea. It's a mystical intuition that echoes the Islamic testimony of faith. There is no God except God. For Ibn Arabi, this means there is none in existence except God.
I can see why this idea might be controversial. It sounds awfully close to pantheism, the belief that God and the universe are identical.
That's a common misconception. Ibn Arabi was very careful to distinguish between God and creation. He insisted that God's essence is utterly transcendent and beyond any limitations.
But if everything is a manifestation of God, how can he still say that God is separate from creation? I'm struggling with this.
Here's the key distinction. For Ibn Arabi, God's essence remains completely hidden, unknowable. We can't grasp it with our limited human intellects. What we experience as creation is a reflection of God's names and attributes, not of his essence itself.
Okay, so let's talk about those names and attributes. How did Ibn Arabi understand them in relation to this idea of wadat al-wujud?
This is where he diverges from the Kalām theologians we talked about earlier. Remember how they believed in distinct eternal attributes belonging to God? Ibn Arabi rejects that idea.
He's saying those attributes aren't separate things added to God.
Exactly. He sees them as relationships between God and creation, not as entities within God himself. Each name, like the knowing or the powerful, describes a way that God interacts with and manifests in the created world.
So it's not that God possesses knowledge or power in some abstract sense, but rather that he bestows knowledge and power on creation through his actions.
You're getting it. And for Ibn Arabi, the ultimate expression of these names and attributes is found in the Muhammadan light.
Ah, yes, the Muhammadan light. This is a concept I've come across before, but it's always seemed a bit shrouded in mystery.
It's a central idea in Ibn Arabi's cosmology. He believed the Muhammadan light was the first emanation from God, the primordial blueprint from which the entire universe unfolded.
So it's like the first and most perfect reflection of God's being, containing all the divine names and attributes that then manifest throughout creation.
Precisely. And within this light are contained all the divine names and attributes, which then manifest in different degrees throughout creation.
And where does the Prophet Muhammad himself fit into this?
For Ibn Arabi, the Prophet Muhammad is the embodiment of the Muhammadan light in the human realm. He is the perfect human being, the one who most fully reflects God's names and attributes in his character and actions.
Wow. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together in Ibn Arabi's grand vision of Tawḥīd. It's this intricate tapestry of God's absolute unity, his self-manifestation through his names, and the role of the Muhammadan light as the bridge between the divine and the created.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
You know, in light of Ibn Arabi's ideas, I'm wondering about those anthropomorphic descriptions of God that we sometimes encounter in Scripture, things like God's hand, face, or descent. How do those fit in with his understanding of God's absolute transcendence?
That's a great question, and Ibn Arabi actually addresses this directly. He would say those descriptions are true, but only with respect to the manifestation of God's names, not to his essence itself. Remember, God's essence remains utterly beyond human comprehension.
So when we come across those descriptions, we shouldn't take them literally as applying to God's hidden essence, but rather as symbolic expressions of how God's names and attributes manifest in the created world, particularly through the Muhammadan light.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limitations of language and understanding that any attempt to describe God will inevitably fall short.
Ibn Arabi's perspective is really challenging me to think about Tawḥīd in a new light. It's not just about affirming God's oneness in a simple way. It's about grasping the dynamic interplay between God's absolute transcendence and his self-manifestation in creation.
That's a great insight. And while Ibn Arabi's ideas might seem worlds apart from the Ismaili emphasis on apophatic theology, there's actually a deeper connection between these two seemingly divergent approaches.
Really, I have to admit, on the surface, they seem almost opposite. The Ismailis are all about negating attributes, while Ibn Arabi is talking about God manifesting through his names and attributes. I'm not seeing the connection.
It's subtle, but it's there. Both Ibn Arabi and the Ismailis are ultimately concerned with safeguarding God's absolute transcendence. They both recognize that human language and concepts are inadequate when we're trying to describe the divine. They just approach this inadequacy from different angles.
So it's like they're both using different tools to achieve the same goal, to protect God from being boxed in by our limited human understanding.
Exactly. Ibn Arabi does this by emphasizing the distinction between God's essence and his names, while the Ismailis achieve it through radical negation. But at the core, they're both trying to point us toward the same truth, that God is ultimately beyond our grasp.
I love how this conversation is revealing the complexities and nuances within Islamic thought on Tawḥīd. It's not a monolithic concept, but rather a rich tapestry of interpretations, each with its own unique insights.
And amidst this diversity of thought, we can find fascinating parallels between seemingly different approaches. For example, remember how Ibn Arabi talked about the Muḥammadan light as the first emanation from God?
Yeah.
Well, the Ismailis have a very similar concept, but they call it the first intellect.
Oh, right. The first intellect, the perfect being that possesses all those qualities that other schools attribute to God. It's like they're both talking about the same thing, but using different language.
That's it. Both the Muḥammadan light and the first intellect serve as intermediaries between God's absolute transcendence and the created world. They are the perfect reflections of God's being while still maintaining the absolute distinction between God and creation.
So for Ibn Arabi, it's the Muḥammadan light that acts as the blueprint for creation. And for the Ismailis, it's the first intellect that plays that role.
You've got it. And both of them see these intermediaries as essential for understanding how God interacts with the world without compromising his absolute unity and transcendence.
This is really making me rethink my whole understanding of Tawḥīd. I'm seeing how these different interpretations, even the ones that seem completely opposite, were actually circling around the same fundamental truths about God's oneness and transcendence.
That's the beauty of exploring Tawḥīd. It's a concept that invites us to think deeply and appreciate the diversity of ways that humans have tried to understand the mystery of the divine.
And speaking of the Ismailis, I'm still eager to hear more about their unique interpretation. We left off with this tantalizing connection between the first intellect and the Imam.
That's where we'll pick up next, delving even deeper into the fascinating world of Ismaili thought. Their approach to Tawḥīd offers a perspective that challenges our assumptions and expands our understanding of what it means to believe in the oneness of God.
Okay, we're back, and I'm really curious to explore this Ismaili idea of the Imam as a reflection of the first intellect. It's such a unique concept, and I'm eager to understand how it plays into their overall understanding of Tawḥīd.
It's definitely a key piece of the puzzle, and it gets to the heart of how Ismailis experience their faith and connect with the divine.
So we've established that the first intellect is this perfect, radiant being emanating from God, embodying all those divine qualities that we might normally attribute to God directly: knowledge, power, will. But the Ismailis say these qualities belong to the first intellect, not to God, in order to maintain God's absolute transcendence.
Exactly, and because the Imam is seen as a reflection of the first intellect, he becomes this essential link for believers.
Okay, I'm following so far, but help me connect the dots here. What does it actually mean for the Imam to be a reflection of the first intellect?
It means that the Imam, in a sense, embodies those divine qualities that emanate from the first intellect. He becomes a guide, a teacher, a source of spiritual illumination for the community.
So by connecting with the Imam, Ismailis are essentially connecting with the first intellect, which in turn helps them approach the unknowable essence of God.
That's a great way to put it. It's like this chain of emanation: God, the first intellect, the Imam, and then the believers. The Imam acts as this bridge, guiding people toward a deeper understanding of Tawḥīd and a closer relationship with the divine.
You know, when we were talking about apophatic theology, it seemed like the Ismailis were saying we can't really say anything about God, that he's completely beyond our grasp. But now with this concept of the first intellect and the Imam, it feels like they're offering a more tangible way to connect with the divine. I'm sensing a bit of a tension there.
It's a good observation, and it highlights the inherent paradox of talking about God. On one hand, the Ismailis are adamant that God's ultimate essence is utterly transcendent beyond any description or limitation. Any attempt to define or categorize God would be to diminish him. That's where apophatic theology comes in, negating any qualities that might box God in.
Right, it's like saying God is beyond our words, beyond our thoughts. We can't define him.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they also recognize that God's presence is experienced in the world, that his power and wisdom are manifest in creation. So they use concepts like the first intellect in the Imam to help us make sense of how the divine interacts with and is reflected in the world without compromising God's absolute transcendence.
So the first intellect and the Imam become these focal points, these ways of experiencing the divine without limiting or defining God himself.
Precisely. They provide a path for believers to connect with the divine on a more tangible level while still acknowledging the ultimate unknowability of God's essence.
This is really fascinating stuff. It's making me realize that understanding Tawḥīd is not just about intellectual concepts and theological debates. It's about finding ways to experience God's unity in our lives.
You've hit the nail on the head. And the beauty of exploring Tawḥīd is that there are so many different paths, so many different ways of approaching this profound truth. We've journeyed through the rational arguments of the Kalām theologians, the mystical insights of Ibn Arabi, the philosophical approach of Ibn Sīnā, and now the unique perspective of the Ismailis.
It's been an incredible journey, and I feel like I've gained a much deeper appreciation for the richness and diversity of Islamic thought. And despite their differences, all of these interpretations point toward that same fundamental truth, the absolute oneness of God.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even within a single faith tradition, there can be such a wide spectrum of understanding and interpretation.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Tawḥīd, what's the key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to recognize that the journey of understanding Tawḥīd is not a destination, but a process. It's about continuously seeking, questioning, and expanding our minds and hearts to grasp the sheer vastness and mystery of God's unity. And it's about recognizing that there are many paths to this understanding, each offering its own unique insights and challenges.
Beautifully said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Tawḥīd. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking that deeper connection with the oneness that binds us all. Until next time.